This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and ideas in Israel, as well as many other things, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and this episode is being recorded in Cape Town, South Africa, as part of the Mervyn Smith Memorial podcast series on South African Jewry. Mervyn Smith was an attorney and a community leader here in South Africa, and this episode is recorded in his memory. My guest today is a historian. He's the director of the Kaplan Center for Jewish Studies and Research at the University of Cape Town, who has recently completed a study on the attitudes and perceptions of black South Africans towards Jewish people in three major cities in this country. I'm now joined by Professor Adam Mendelson. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So I think that the principal finding in this study is that the attitudes and perceptions of black South Africans towards Jewish people are marked mainly by ignorance. 2/3 of the respondents couldn't remember ever having interacted with a Jew. A few could distinguish between Jews and Muslims. Most had a vague notion of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and an even a vaguer notion of how the Jews are connected to it, and they generally had no exceptionally positive or negative notion of the Jews as opposed to other religious or ethnic groups in the country. So my question to you is this finding reassuring or disconcerting?
Certainly it's surprising in a variety of ways. The South African press, despite the very small size of the Jewish population in South Africa, gives disproportionate attention to Israel and to Jewish matters. And I think there are a variety of explanations for why this is the case. But the newspapers, particularly in Cape Town, but in Johannesburg and elsewhere too, are full of coverage of Israel. And one of the things which motivated this study was to get a sense of, does this actually filter into popular perception or does this reflect popular reception? Are Jews on the minds of ordinary South Africans in any sort of way, or does the thinking about Jews reflect the reality that this is a population of probably less than 70,000? And what we discovered when we began to think about a study of this kind was that we had no idea that serious studies of black perceptions of Jews did not exist or had not been done since the 1970s, and then had only been done in a very limited way. And we knew a lot about what white South Africans think about Jews, and particularly what Afrikaners think about Jews, because this was a subject of concern really into the 1980s with the fixation of extremists on the Afrikaans political spectrum with Jews and some sort of openly anti-Semitic political actors in South Africa. So we knew a lot about white South African views about Jews. We knew almost nothing about what black South Africans thought about Jews. On the one hand, just to answer your question more directly, it can be read as reassuring that despite the newspaper coverage, despite the fact that Jews are held out to be far more prominent than they are in reality in South African society, given their small numbers, that Jewish power and Jewish influence is not a major concern amongst ordinary people.
And it's certainly not the stereotypes about Jews that we see elsewhere.
Absolutely, and certainly many of those classic stereotypes aren't attached to Jews, we discovered in our study.
But to Indians.
To Indians, absolutely. So, and this in a way plays into that sort of classic theory of how prejudice operates and places where Jews do well, that this idea of the lightning rod theory, that in a way it's handy for Jews to live in societies where there are groups which stand out more than Jews, and that certainly seems to be the case in South Africa, that Indians are subject to many of the prejudices which historically or traditionally would be attached to Jews, the idea that they're powerful, that they're scheming, that they have money, that they are particularly well educated, that they are clever, etc., that those ideas are attached much more in our findings to Indians than to Jews. In truth, there are many more Indians in South Africa than there are Jews, but that obviously in other places hasn't stopped Jews from being the target of intense prejudice. So on the one hand, Jews are seen as, or not seen, they're largely invisible. On the other hand, if you have been involved in the efforts of the Jewish community, which have been going on for now decades, to extol the contribution of Jews to South African society, this is a bit of a disappointment, a letdown, that all the charitable work, all the conspicuous displays of patriotism, that doesn't seem to be having an impact on the opinions of ordinary black South Africans.
What do you think that is? Is it, relative indifference to the role Jews play, either negatively, justifiably so or not, or positively in South African? Is it because just, those ordinary black South Africans have other things on their mind?
I think that's certainly the case, that this is a society with intense problems. It also reflects the parochialism of South African society, and that certainly we see that with lack of awareness or interest in international affairs. It's partly, I think, a reflection of the very limited contact in reality that many black South Africans have with Jews, or knowing contact with Jews. So they might be encountering Jews on the streets or elsewhere, but again, for the most part, South African Jews are still secular and aren't discernibly Jewish in their dress. So it partly reflects that. Also, I think it reflects the actual diversity of South African society, that it's a place with lots of minorities, religious minorities, ethnic, tribal, etc. minorities, and that Jews barely feature in this matrix, which I think, again, can be seen as a positive thing, that, this is another strange group in a society which is full of strange groups in the eyes of many ordinary South Africans.
Yeah, but do you think that the ordinary South Africans, the black South Africans, see Jews as just a subcategory of whites?
We asked again questions trying to get to this question: do you see Jews as whites and as ordinary whites? And what's interesting and perhaps can be seen as troubling is that there is divergence there, that when we ask people the same questions about what do you think of whites, and do they have too much power, too much influence, or the reverse of that, positive ideas about whites, that there's a distinct difference between attitudes towards whites and attitudes towards Jews. And again, I read that as being a function of this, that Jews are an empty category for most people. They're a group which there aren't really strong feelings about, and whereas whites, there are strong feelings, and it turns out often quite positive feelings about whites. But Jews are this amorphous, somewhat unknown group you might have encountered through your pastor preaching on a Sunday. There might be, again, certain faint signifiers, so words which have meaning, which are at the back of your mind but aren't particularly powerful, and those are attached to Jews. But for the most part, as I said, I think that Jews are this category which there isn't deep
which is
meaning.
Pretty strange, because if I remember correctly, in the report, there's an overwhelming majority of Christians. I mean, the respondents are overwhelmingly Christians, and in their religion, there has to be some sort of, at least theological connection to Judaism. How do you account for this discrepancy?
So I think that my sense is that some of the ideas which are attached to Jews are drawn from a religious source. My sense, though, at the same time, is that our findings might suggest that the level of religious education in reality is relatively low. And even more broadly, I think that the level of education formal education is relatively low as well. And again, that there isn't an automatic correlation in people's minds between talking about the people of Israel or the Israelites and Jews, that Jews, again, aren't the focus of fixation of Sunday sermons in the way that there would be in other churches. Likewise, I think what confuses matters in a South African context is that certain terminology which has clear meaning elsewhere, like Zionist or Zionism, and even Jew, has alternative meanings in a South African context, that the Zionist Christian Church, which is one of the largest non-Protestant denominations in South Africa, is not a group interested in Israel. It's a syncretic African religious group. And its name is the ZCC, the Zionist Christian Church. And so what does it mean to be Zionist or anti-Zionist in South Africa if you're black? It's confusing, or at least the more automatic assumption is that you're a member of this particular church as opposed to a supporter of Israel. And I think the same thing with Jew is that I think it's taken on over time meanings the term has taken on meanings over time which are distinct from how Jew is thought of in other contexts. Again, there's perhaps some prejudice attached to the term Jew, but it's not sort of classic European anti-Semitic ideas that we're seeing, at least that those aren't predominant when the term Jew is mentioned.
Tell us a bit about the previous studies. You said that they were conducted many years ago in the 70s and in a limited manner. Can you draw parallels between the two? Is there any trend you can look at all, or are they really that separate?
They were very limited in scale, and I think that the idea was there was something new in the 1960s and 1970s, and very forward-looking, with a sense of, again, not knowing what the attitudes of black South Africans towards was Jews. And
why did it matter at all in the 70s? I mean, did anyone account for what black people thought in the 1970s?
So certainly there was at that time, particularly in the early 70s, a sense that the politics of South Africa were changing. So the emergence perhaps of renewed protest within South African society, greater radicalism amongst young black South Africans in particular, probably an awareness of developments within an American context as well, the emergence again of black power and other such things, and an interest probably in tracking how this filters into or does this have resonance in a South African context. And those studies often focused on, as I said, limited studies, anthropological and sociological studies, interested in interviewing black South Africans about their views of Jews. These studies, for the most part, petered out because of, again, broader events within South Africa, that sort of emergence of student protests and other such things, and they aren't carried into the late 1970s and 1980s. So what we do see in some of that work is perhaps stronger stereotyping than we see today. We saw in our studies. So more perhaps of those classic ideas about Jews emerging then than today. And that might again reflect that the South African population today is a very young population, that we've had a baby boom over the last really 2 decades. And I think people who've grown up since the end of apartheid have grown up in a world very different from that of the 60s and 70s and onwards. So
you mean education, culture? Education,
culture, sort of interaction and sense of the world, all those sort of things. I think it's a very different South African population now than it was even 5 decades ago.
Mm-hmm. And can you draw any conclusions about, I mean, of course the focus here was Jews, but you addressed other religious and ethnic groups. And kind of methodologically, is it really, I mean, can you draw parallels about, black attitudes towards whites or black attitudes towards Indians, etc.? Is it like on an equal footing?
So certainly much more of our attention in the study was focused on Jews, but the idea behind having these comparative categories was not to look at Jews in isolation. One of our critiques of studies which had been done here and elsewhere, which had looked at attitudes more broadly, so the big study by the ADL internationally, I think called the Global 100, is that they hadn't done this sort of comparative, or didn't have a comparative baseline.
How did South Africa fare on that, by the way? Do you remember?
Good question. So,
all right, I would like to put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
I haven't looked at it in a while, but so I don't have a good answer with that. But when I did look at it now before we initiated the study, my sense was that it was telephone interviews in a relatively limited and without a baseline to compare it to. And our objective here was to get a sense. So if there are these attitudes towards Jews, what's the context that they exist in? Are views about Jews stronger or weaker than those towards a whole variety of other groups? So we looked at attitudes, for example, towards foreigners, white foreigners, black foreigners. We looked at attitudes towards Muslims, towards Indians, etc., towards whites, to get a sense of, if strong attitudes towards Jews do appear, how do these compare with attitudes towards other groups? So we get a sense of the matrix here as opposed to an individual group. And as I was suggesting earlier, the attitudes certainly towards Indians were much stronger than towards Jews, that consistently applying ideas, classic anti-Semitic ideas, to Indians as opposed to Jews. And
is it because they stand out? Because they look different?
So it's probably a number of factors. Certainly a much larger population in the South African context. Certainly a very troubled history of relations between Indians and black South Africans, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal and in Durban. Likewise, Indians have been in the press in a significant way. This study was conducted at a time when the Gupta family, who are Indian origin, were involved very publicly in a corrupt relationship with the then South African president, Jacob Zuma. So there's a lot of attention to Indians in the press. And I think also visibility in another important way, which is that Jews in the past had been very involved in petty commerce or in shopkeeping. And now so it's certainly the case to some extent, but you'd have to know that Pick and Pay is owned by a Jewish family, et cetera, that other large retail chains were started by, and in many cases still have Jewish owners or Jewish partners. But in terms of the daily commercial interaction between ordinary black customers and shopkeepers, that is much less of that than there once was. That it used to be the Jews-dominated parts of petty commerce in South Africa. It's long since ceased to be the case. And now in certain parts of the country, Indians and others are the stand-ins for Jews.
So the less frequent interaction is not just perceived, it's not just in the mind. I mean, maybe they're unaware of who the person they're talking to is, of what religion it is. It's just, a lot less than it used to be because the Jews are not in those areas of interaction anymore.
Certainly that's part of the story. I mean, it's a story likewise of the contraction of the Jewish population in South Africa, that from a height of about 123,000 in the early 1970s to maybe 70,000 today, but also one of contraction in a different way, which is that Jews who really began in South Africa in many cases in petty commerce or in trading, merchandising, things of that kind, have urbanized. So they aren't present in rural districts and in small commercial towns in the way they once were, but also much more clustered in the professions and other areas where your interactions are less likely to be daily commercial interactions with customers, but maybe professional interactions or managerial interactions, etc. So it's a different dynamic.
And is this something that was prominent in the studies from the 1970s, or were they too limited?
They're too limited to get a sense of that, of exactly that. So the studies of the 1970s were again promising, but ultimately stillborn. Ultimately, were not carried forward in a way to give us a broad picture of black attitudes towards Jews.
Why the focus on Cape Town, Johannesburg and Durban? Is it because they are the three major Jewish concentrations in the country? So
partly that. So the largest Jewish population in South Africa, without question, is in Johannesburg, followed then by Cape Town, and then a significantly smaller Jewish population in Durban. We looked at a whole variety of different models. I mean, in the ideal world, we want to conduct a study which looked at rural environments and urban environments. We would want to look at a city without a Jewish population or a very small Jewish population, again, as a control in a way. And we looked at these, we costed these. Ultimately, we decided let's focus on the places where there actually are Jews. And there are likewise differences between these cities. So the nature of the black population in Cape Town is very different from certainly Johannesburg and Durban as well, in terms of its composition, in terms of its education levels, et cetera, et cetera.
And also it allows you probably to tap into different classes, social classes.
Exactly so. In fact, one of the, again, interesting findings of the study related to how different Cape Town is certainly from Johannesburg, that Johannesburg really does live up to its reputation of being the commercial center, more cosmopolitan black population, which is more diverse, better educated than that in Cape Town, more tolerant, because perhaps people are encountering difference in ways that they're less likely to in Cape Town. So again, and this is reflected in attitudes towards Jews and towards others as well, that Cape Town, again, has a reputation within South Africa as being the least friendly of the big cities, and this is borne out in the data, in that Cape Townians are hostile towards everyone in our findings. So in Johannesburg, much less, much more positive. And it's, again, that classic idea that encountering difference can persuade people to be accepting of difference, and I think we see that in Johannesburg in particular.
And are you planning to look at it over time? I mean, are you going to repeat these studies to look at trends, or really the fact that the findings were that there weren't any significant findings put you off?
No, certainly we would want to do this again. I mean, I think again in a sort of 5-year time frame. We would also want to drill down here and look at a particular subgroups. So this was the idea was our sample was representative of black South Africans, certainly urban black South Africans. But we don't have a clear sense. We have some data, but not enough data, which looks at what do well-educated black South Africans, and that small subset, what do they think about Jews? So those who've gone to universities, who are likely to be future thought leaders in South Africa, opinion makers, opinion leaders, do they think differently from ordinary South Africans about Jews? And so we've thought about expanding the study to look at particularly university campuses. What does this future black elite think about Jews, with a sense that the feelings of the broader population in a way matter less than do the future elite. And if their feelings, if they're more politicized, if they're more focused on or think differently about Israel than do the man in the street and the woman in the street, that actually might matter more than the broad picture which we have here.
Yeah, it's really remarkable how Israel doesn't really play a role in this study, this particular one that you conducted last year.
Absolutely. And as I suggested earlier, one of the motivations behind the study was to get a sense of, does the extensive press coverage actually reflect a popular sentiment? So what's driving it? And has this press, or on the other hand, has this fixation in the press and within the African National Congress on Israel, has this filtered into popular perception? The answer is very much not. That we found roughly 10% of the black population, people we spoke to, had any sense of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or a sense of events within Israel. And of those, an even divide in terms of sentiment. So as likely to be sympathetic towards Palestinians as towards Israelis, but for the most part, a very, very limited sense of events within Israel. And I suspect, in reality, a very limited sense of events outside of South Africa more broadly. That this is
it really says a lot about the detachment between the political and the media discourse and that of the ordinary people, much more than elsewhere, I would guess.
Absolutely. I wonder, I suppose, that's it'd be useful to ask that question elsewhere, is that we know how much attention there is to Israel in the press, and we know how vocal supporters and detractors are, but how many people are they actually speaking for in reality? I mean, is this phenomenon that we see here something which would be generalizable elsewhere? And I wonder that maybe that it speaks to a broader reality that those who fixated on Israel are fixated on Israel, and the majority are less concerned.
Which brings me again to my first point, which is it's reassuring and disconcerting at the same time, I suppose.
Indeed. My sense, though, speaking not as an academic but as a member of a Jewish community, is that ultimately invisibility is not a bad thing. That South Africa has genuine problems, and Jews are not part of those problems, in the sense of we're not a source of the problems. It's a small community which is involved in trying to fix issues in the society, but we need to be. It's damaging to our egos to discover that we aren't as important as we believe we are. But ultimately, that's true. We are a very small minority in a much larger country, and there's opportunity here to shape how Jews are seen, which again there aren't very strong fixed ideas. I take to be a good thing.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Adam Mendelson, thank you very much for joining us today.
A great pleasure. Thank you.
And also big thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, to Itai Shalom, our producer, to the Van Leeuwen Institute for their support, and especially to the Mervyn Smith Memorial Fund for making this interview possible. We'd also like to thank Peter Frey and Carrie Shapiro and the Romay Foundation, who made a very generous contribution to the Tel Aviv Review, and to those of you out there supporting us through Patreon. If you like what we do here almost as much as we do, please consider becoming a patron. Just go to our website, scroll down, and click the Become a Patron button. You'll get plenty of perks in return, and of course be able to join our quest for learning and knowledge. In the meantime, don't forget to check out our archive. There are more than 400 interviews to keep you busy, entertained, and hopefully annoyed. Like us on Facebook. Our page is called The Tel Aviv Review Ideas from Israel, and follow me and my co-host Dalia on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.